Over the past episodes, we've been digging through Apple's UNIX origins, from AUX to cross-platform compatibility layers like the Macintosh application environment for UNIX, to Rhapsody, the bridge product born out of the Next acquisition, combining NextStep with Mac DNA, and finally Mac OS X Server 1.0, the first real commercial offspring of that whole project. But as fascinating as Rhapsody was, it didn't feel like the future Macintosh operating system users and developers alike had been waiting for.
And now, Mac OS. Most important piece of software we've got.
The big question was whether Apple could fix this with Mac OS X 10.0 without breaking the entire Mac ecosystem.
And so we decided to go further.
Under the dust, there's history waiting to boot. I'm the Vintage Collector, and these are my stories. After the Next acquisition, Apple's roadmap looked clear on paper. Rhapsody would bring the NextStep foundation to the Macintosh.
I would like to invite Steve out and have him show you a little bit about what he's been doing for the last decade. Steve?
But Rhapsody felt more like a Unix workstation product with a weird identity crisis. The UI was a mix of the Mac OS 8 Platinum interface and NextStep. It only ran classic Macintosh applications inside Blue Box, a sandboxed compatibility environment. While Rhapsody provided Yellow Box, an evolved version of the NextStep APIs, software developers were reluctant to rewrite their applications from scratch. And they pushed back hard. The idea just wasn't realistic, and Blue Box wasn't a satisfying long-term answer either. By the time Apple took stage at WWDC 1998, the message had changed.
The problem was, when you ran the existing Mac apps under this Blue Box thing, you didn't get any of the new features.
Apple had listened and changed strategies. Instead of forcing a clean break, Apple introduced a transition plan designed to move the Macintosh ecosystem forward without abandoning everything that already existed. This is the moment Carbon enters the story, and Apple admitted that the clean break had failed.
What we found was, literally, after 15 years, there was a lot of barnacles and cruft in there. About 2,000 of those APIs are bad news. To allow you to implement some of the functionality we're taking away with the bad APIs. We've named that API set for Mac OS X Carbon.
It wasn't meant to replace the NextStep APIs, but to buy time and create momentum. It took a large part of the classic Mac OS Toolbox APIs and adapted them for the new system, serving as a bridge technology that lasted for 12 years and was only deprecated in 2012, far longer than Apple originally intended. Meanwhile, Cocoa, as the refined descendant of Yellow Box and formerly the NextStep APIs, formed the basis for the long-term future.
Classic runs Mac OS 9 apps as is, without modification. Carbonized apps get the new features. Now, what's a carbonized app? It's something that takes a developer a few months, 1 to 3 months, to carbonize their app to get it ready for OS X. And all of a sudden it springs to life with all of the new features of OS X. And the third API is Cocoa. It's completely different. It's fully object-oriented. You can write applications in Java or other object-oriented languages and get all of those benefits.
In September 2000, Apple released the Mac OS X public beta to the public as a $29.95 paid preview.
Now, when we talk about user interfaces, let me show you. This is it. No.
It was a strong statement, revealing what macOS 10 would look like, including the new Aqua interface and the dock, built on top of a UNIX foundation Apple now called Darwin. The beta was unfinished, it was slow, and it even had an expiration date. But it did exactly what Apple needed. It made the future visible. It gave users and developers something to react to, and it proved that macOS 10 was no longer just an internal experiment, but a real product. And while Apple kept core components like Aqua, the Quartz compositor, Carbon and Cocoa closed source, they released the underlying BSD Darwin operating system as open source, along with the XNU kernel and other components. Even though the new macOS 10 development stream initially still looked a lot like Rhapsody, or what is unofficially referred to as NextStep 5, it soon began drifting away and developed its own identity. With the final release of macOS 10 10.0, the entire installation experience looked far more polished and appealing. Gone were the days of using a macOS 9 based installed environment from the Rhapsody era, with bits and pieces still obviously reminiscent of NextStep. It looked and felt like a Mac, while under the hood this was a modern UNIX system, complete with real user accounts, file permissions, POSIX compatibility and a proper command line, even though Apple would not pursue formal UNIX 03 certification until macOS 10 10.5 Leopard. The Blue Box, which ran its own copy of macOS 8 inside the virtualized environment on Rhapsody, still existed, although it was heavily modified and improved and now simply called the Classic environment. Unlike Blue Box, Classic doesn't run macOS 8 off a virtual hard drive image. Instead, it uses an existing instance of macOS 9 on your hard drive. And that is mandatory as it refuses to run with macOS 8. No big deal here, as in the beginning a copy of macOS 9 was bundled with full retail copies of macOS 10. Reusing an existing macOS 9 was really clever, as it not only conserves disk space but also saves you from maintaining two different copies of macOS 9. And you could always boot into macOS 9 natively should an application refuse to run inside Classic for compatibility reasons. And since all disk partitions are natively accessible from macOS 10, you don't need to fumble around with cryptic CLI tools to access the contents inside a virtual disk image, like it was the case on Rhapsody's Blue Box. While the latter always ran in full screen mode, essentially hiding away the macOS 10 desktop, the new Classic environment offered seamless mode. Even though Classic apps would clearly be recognizable by the Classic window decorations and the Apple menu bar on the top, it was definitely less intrusive from a user experience point of view. Restarting the Classic environment can be done from the Classic control panel. Or you locate the Classic startup binary beneath the Core Services folder. Here you'll also find the ROM image that is used to start the Classic environment. It can also be started from the Unix command line, and there's even a set of command line arguments which largely correspond to the com.apple.classic properties. It's possible to inspect the startup process, but not to run it in full screen mode. Although there is a plist property to use the Classic Finder, this leads to an endless loop, even though there's some hackery possible to make it start anyway. But still, there's no way to bring up a full screen session of Classic. This gives us a glimpse into how Apple treated Classic not as an emulator, but as a tightly integrated subsystem. When Mac OS X was released, it was imminent that the entire ecosystem was in a transition phase. Only a few apps leveraged the Carbon APIs and even fewer were based on Cocoa yet. Even Apple components like the Finder, QuickTime, iTunes and others remained on Carbon for years to come.
We believe that you got to eat your own dog food. And what that means is, if we're going to be developing new APIs for you, we have to be developing for them first. We have to find out if they really do serve the needs of the developers. But the biggest of those is a brand new Finder. And believe me, a Finder is a wonderful test case for Carbon.
The Finder in particular, although rewritten for Mac OS X, was missing features longtime Mac users relied on, reinforcing the sense that Mac OS X 10.0 was still a work in progress. Unlike classic applications, Carbon apps didn't run inside Mac OS IX at all. They were native Mac OS X applications, but built using updated versions of the older Toolbox APIs. Because of that, they could adopt the new Aqua interface and behave like modern OS X software, even though their roots still lay in the classic Mac world. A good example is the preview of Internet Explorer 5 that came bundled with Mac OS X. Visually, it fit right in with Aqua, but under the hood it was still a Carbon application, not a Cocoa one. Trying to upgrade the preview version with a later version 5.21 bails right away because it requires a newer version than Mac OS X 10.0. Virtual PC requires 10.1.5 as a minimum, and Adobe Photoshop 7 also refuses to run. Only being partly carbonized, it requires OS X 10.1.3 as a minimum. Photoshop 6 runs just fine, but only inside the classic environment, and the same holds true for Adobe Acrobat 4, which was current at the time. At least with how classic was implemented and the option to dual boot, almost nothing was left behind. But living with early Mac OS X also meant dealing with a system that was still very much in flux. Even basic maintenance felt different compared to what we're used to today. Let's do an upgrade to macOS 10.0.3 just to relive the experience. There is no in-service software upgrade from the running OS yet. Instead, you have to reboot from the macOS 10 install CD to perform the upgrade. Now, if you remember my Rhapsody episode, you might recall that one of those upgrades wiped out my entire system. I'm very happy to report that this time the upgrade behaves exactly as it should and actually keeps the installation intact. However, OS X 10.0 was heavily criticized for being too slow in general, with many users either remaining on or switching back to macOS 9. This was the biggest weakness of macOS X, and for many users it outweighed everything else. It introduced full preemptive multitasking, protected memory and proper process isolation. Apple even demonstrated this dramatically on stage, crashing a test app known as the Bumpe without bringing down the rest of the system, something that would have been impossible on earlier versions of the macOS. Users loved OS X's stability and modern architecture, but still went back simply because OS 9 felt faster and more responsive. And there were also obscure bugs visible here and there, like what happened to me here with the classic Stuffit expander, where the up icon just remains randomly on the screen instead of ending up in the dock. And that dock wasn't just eye candy, it completely changed how users launched and switched between applications. Ironically, the idea wasn't new at all. While other systems had similar launch bars and panels, the dock already existed in NextStep, and even the early OPENSTEP 4 preview showed more modern but eventually discarded interface concepts. Then Rhapsody completely moved away from the NextStep dock. With macOS X, the dock returned, this time as a central part of the user experience, blending application launching, window management and status indication into one persistent element at the bottom of the screen. Apple would eventually address negative user concerns with macOS 10 10.1, a major overhaul that arrived only 6 months later in September 2001 and was made available for free. It gave users exactly what was missing from the first version: large system-wide performance enhancements, CD-ROM burning support directly in the Finder, and significantly faster 3D graphics through improved OpenGL drivers. macOS 10 10.1 was codenamed Puma because Apple considered it one fast cat. By January 2002, Apple began shipping macOS 10 10.1.2 as the default operating system on new Macs, only 10 months after the initial release of macOS 10 10.0. If you were around during the Rhapsody days or remember installing macOS 10 10.0 for the first time, I'd really love to hear about your experience. Did you stick with OS 9 for performance, struggle with classic compatibility, or jump straight into Aqua and never look back? Share your memories in the comments below. I'm the Vintage Collector, and this was my story for today. Thanks for watching, and see you again next Sunday.